On June 10, 1944, in a camp near Orléans in occupied France, a group of captured German women watched in stunned silence as American soldiers, donning khaki uniforms, warmly embracing their loved ones on the platform, kissed their wives and girlfriends goodbye in full view of everyone. Their shock wasn't at the war, but at this display of open affection. What they saw that day irrevocably changed everything they believed about the enemy and how they would see themselves. The trucks came at dawn, engines growling through the fog like metal beasts. 37 German women, nurses, radio operators, clerks from the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, sat huddled in the back, their grey uniforms stained with mud and fear. They'd been captured 3 days earlier near Caen, when the Allies overran their field hospital. Now they were being transported somewhere unknown, somewhere that smelled of diesel and salt air, and the acrid tang of their own sweat. Helga Müller pressed her back against the truck's metal side, feeling every bump in the road rattle through her spine. She was 23, blonde, trained to believe in the Führer's vision of a pure and orderly world. She'd volunteered for service because it was her duty, because good German girls supported their men at the front. Now she was a prisoner, and everything she'd been taught told her what to expect. Brutality, degradation, perhaps worse. The propaganda films had been clear. American soldiers were mongrels, undisciplined and crude. Their women were painted whores who danced to Negro music. Their culture was a sickness spreading across the world. Beside her, Margaret whispered a prayer, her rosary beads clicking softly. Across from them, Erica stared straight ahead, her jaws set, refusing to show weakness. They'd made a pact the night before, sleeping in a barn under guard. Whatever happens, we remain German, we remain strong. We do not break. The truck lurched to a stop. Canvas flaps were pulled back, and sunlight poured in, blinding and warm. American voices barked orders in English, words they couldn't quite grasp. Helga climbed down, her legs shaking, and found herself standing in a compound surrounded by barbed wire. But it wasn't what she'd imagined. The ground was swept clean. Buildings stood in neat rows. Somewhere, a radio played music, not martial, but light, almost cheerful. An American soldier gestured toward a barrack, his face neither cruel nor kind, just tired. Professional. Is this a trick? Helga thought, her fingers curling into fists. They lull us into comfort, then strike. But no strike came, only the strange, disorienting feeling of waiting for horror that never arrived. The camp at Orly had been established 3 weeks earlier, a temporary holding facility for Axis prisoners awaiting transport to Britain or the United States. It consisted of 12 barracks, a mess hall, an administration building, and a watchtower on each corner. The American guards rotated in 8-hour shifts, most of them young men from places like Iowa and Georgia. Farm boys who'd never expected to be babysitting German women in occupied France. Helga and the others were processed that first afternoon. Names recorded, possessions catalogued, photographs taken. They were given thin mattresses, 2 blankets each, and a bar of soap that smelled like lavender. The American corporal who handed out supplies, a freckled boy who couldn't have been older than 20, smiled apologetically when he ran out of towels. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, though Helga didn't understand the words, just the tone, polite, almost embarrassed. The women gathered in their assigned barrack after dark, speaking in hushed German, comparing notes. The guards hadn't touched them. The food had been plain but edible, bread, soup, coffee that was surprisingly good. No one had screamed obscenities or threatened violence. Instead, there was an eerie orderliness, a sense of bureaucratic routine that felt more unsettling than outright hostility. "They're waiting," Erica insisted, sitting on her bunk with her arms crossed, "building our trust before they strike." Margaret wasn't so sure. "Did you see how that young soldier looked at us? Like we were people. Propaganda, Erika spat. They want us confused. But Helga said nothing. She lay on her mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the camp at night. Footsteps on gravel, distant laughter from the guards' quarters, the hum of a generator, and underneath it all, something she couldn't name. A quiet that felt less like imprisonment and more like suspension, as if the war had paused just long enough for everyone to catch their breath. She thought of home. In her mother's kitchen in Stuttgart, the smell of roasted apples, the way her father used to read the newspaper with such certainty. Everything had been clear then. Germany was right. Germany was strong. The enemy was everything Germany was not. But here, in this strange, in-between place, nothing felt clear at all. On the third day, something shifted. The women had fallen into a rhythm, roll call at dawn, meals at fixed hours, afternoons spent sitting in the yard under supervision, evenings in the barrack. They were allowed to write letters, though they knew they'd be censored. They could walk the perimeter as long as they stayed inside the wire. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't the nightmare they'd been promised either. That afternoon, a convoy of American trucks arrived, carrying soldiers returning from leave. The women watched from their barrack windows as the men climbed down, duffel bags slung over shoulders, their faces tanned and grinning. And then the gates opened, and something extraordinary happened. Civilians poured in, wives, girlfriends, mothers, children. The women wore summer dresses and lipstick, their hair curled and pinned. The children carried hand-drawn welcome signs, and as the soldiers dropped their bags and rushed forward, the air filled with shouts of joy, with laughter, with the sound of reunion. And then, right there in the middle of the compound, in full view of guards and prisoners and God himself, they kissed. Not quick, stolen kisses hidden in shadows, but real, deep, unashamed embraces. Men lifted women off their feet, spinning them around, pressing lips to lips while their children tugged at their legs, and the guards smiled and turned away to give them privacy. Helga stood frozen at the window, her breath caught in her throat. Beside her, Margaret gasped softly. Erika's mouth hung open. "Mein Gott," someone whispered. "In der Öffentlichkeit." In public. In broad daylight, as if love were not something shameful, something to be hidden away in bedrooms and darkness, as if affection between a man and a woman were as natural as breathing. That evening, the women could talk of nothing else. They sat in a circle on their bunks, voices low and urgent, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. "It's obscene," Erika insisted, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Decent people don't behave that way." "But they seemed happy," Margaret said quietly. "Did you see their faces?" Helga said nothing. She kept seeing it over and over, the way the soldier had cupped his wife's face, the way she'd smiled against his mouth, the way their daughter had clapped her hands in delight. There had been no shame in it, no vulgarity, just pure, uncomplicated joy. In Germany, such displays would have been unthinkable. A man might kiss his wife's hand in public, perhaps her cheek if he were feeling particularly sentimental. But this open celebration of physical affection, it went against everything she'd been taught about propriety, about German dignity, about the correct relationship between men and women. And yet, maybe, Helga said slowly, her voice barely audible. Maybe we were taught wrong about some things. The silence that followed was deafening. Erika glared at her. Margarete looked frightened, but no one contradicted her. Because they'd all seen it. They'd all felt that strange twist in their chests, that uncomfortable sense that the world they thought they knew was built on sand. Somewhere outside, a guard was whistling. The tune was unfamiliar, but strangely beautiful. And for the first time since her capture, Helga allowed herself to wonder, what else have they lied to us about? The next morning, one of the guards, a sergeant named Miller, tall and soft-spoken, noticed the women's unusual quietness during roll call. He spoke to the translator, a French woman who worked for the Americans, asking if something was wrong. When the translator explained what the women had witnessed, Miller's face broke into a grin. He said something in English, laughing, and the translator turned to the women. He says, "Welcome to America, where we kiss our wives and aren't ashamed of it." A few of the women blushed. Erica scowled. But Helga found herself smiling, just a small, involuntary quirk of her lips. Miller noticed. He winked at her, then walked away, still chuckling to himself. It was such a small moment. A wink, a laugh, a casual acknowledgement of their shared humanity, but it cracked something open inside Helga, some carefully constructed wall she'd spent years building. Because at that moment, she realized that the enemy wasn't a monster. He was just a man who loved his wife and found the idea of hiding that love absurd. And if they'd been wrong about that, about something so fundamental as whether love should be public or private, what else had they been wrong about? The question would haunt her for the rest of the war and long after. The routine came quickly, as routines always do in captivity. Wake at 6 to the sound of a bugle. Roll call at 6:30, standing in neat rows while the guards counted heads and checked names against clipboards. Breakfast at 7, oatmeal, toast, sometimes eggs, always coffee. Then work details, laundry, kitchen duty, cleaning barracks, tending the small vegetable garden the Americans had planted behind the mess hall. The work wasn't hard, not like the exhausting shifts at the field hospital, but it was strange. Working alongside the enemy. American soldiers supervised, but they didn't shout or threaten. They demonstrated tasks, nodded approval, occasionally cracked jokes the women couldn't understand, but laughed at anyway because the tone was unmistakably friendly. Afternoons were for rest or recreation. The women could read. The Americans had provided a small library of German books, though most were American novels badly translated. They could write letters, they could sit in the yard and talk, always under the watchful eyes of guards in the towers. And always, there were the couples. They came on Sundays mostly, families visiting the American soldiers stationed at the camp. But sometimes, during the week too, a wife bringing lunch to her husband, a girlfriend surprising her sweetheart between shifts. And every time, the same ritual. Embraces, kisses, hands held without shame, children running circles around their parents' legs while the lovers smiled into each other's faces. Helga watched obsessively. She couldn't help herself. She watched the way a soldier's hand would rest on the small of his wife's back, protective but not possessive. The way couples would walk arm in arm past the German women without seeming to care who saw them. The way they'd kiss goodbye at the gate. Not quick, furtive pecks, but real kisses. The kind that said, "I love you, I'll miss you, come back to me safe." Back home, her fiancé Klaus had kissed her exactly twice. Once when he proposed, a stiff brush of lips against her cheek. Once before he left for the Eastern Front, a slightly longer kiss, still chaste, performed in her parents' parlor with her mother watching approvingly from the doorway. She'd thought that was love. Proper, German, dignified love. Now she wasn't sure what to think. It happened on a Tuesday, during kitchen duty. Helga was peeling potatoes when Sergeant Miller walked in, checking on the day's meal preparation. He paused beside her workstation, watching her efficient movements, and said something in English. The translator, Marie, the French woman who'd become a familiar presence, smiled and turned to Helga. "He says you're very good at that. Did you work in a kitchen before the war?" Helga shook her head, her hands continuing their steady rhythm. "My mother taught me. Every German girl learns to cook," Marie translated. Miller nodded, said something else, his tone conversational. "He wants to know if you like it here. The camp, he means." It was such an unexpected question that Helga stopped peeling, the knife suspended in midair. She looked up at Miller, really looked at him for the first time. He had kind eyes, she noticed. Tired eyes, like he'd seen too much but was trying to remain decent anyway. Es ist nicht wie ich erwartet habe, she said slowly, then tried in halting English. It is not what I expected. Miller smiled, a sad, knowing smile. War never is, he said, and somehow Helga understood the words, or at least their meaning. He started to walk away, then turned back. My wife, he said, gesturing to his ring finger. She writes to me every week. She says... He paused, searching for words the German woman might understand. She says love is the only thing that makes sense when nothing else does. Helga didn't respond. Couldn't respond. But that night, lying on her bunk in the darkness, she thought about Klaus. She tried to remember his face, but all she could see was Sergeant Miller's sad smile, and all she could hear was his wife's words. Love is the only thing that makes sense. When had she last received a letter from Klaus? 3 months. 4. The war had swallowed him, and she didn't even know if he was still alive. The moment came without warning, the way all transformative moments do. It was a Saturday morning in late June, warm and bright, and a train had arrived carrying soldiers on weekend leave. Their families had gathered at the small platform just outside the camp's main gate, visible through the wire. The German women had been allowed outside for recreation, and they stood in small clusters in the yard, trying not to watch but unable to look away. The train's whistle blew. Steam hissed, doors opened, and men in American uniforms poured out, dropping their bags, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. And then the reunions began. A soldier swept a young woman into his arms, lifting her off her feet, spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. A gray-haired woman threw herself at a young corporal, her son clearly, and he buried his face in her shoulder. 2 children broke free from their mother's grip and tackled their father, all 3 of them tumbling into the grass in a tangle of limbs and joy. And everywhere, kisses. On lips, on cheeks, on foreheads, on hands. Public, unashamed, beautiful. One of the guards, a young private named Anderson, was standing near the fence, watching the scene with a smile. He noticed the German women staring and walked over, his expression gentle. "Pretty nice, huh?" he said, though most of them couldn't understand. He gestured toward the platform, then to his own heart, then to his lips. "Here," he said simply. "This is just goodbye." Marie, standing nearby, translated. "Ici, c'est juste au revoir." The women stood in stunned silence. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Erika turned away, her jaw clenched, but Helga stared at the platform, at all those people loving each other without shame, and felt something break inside her chest. "Nur lebe wohl," she whispered. "Just goodbye. Just goodbye." As if love were that simple, as if showing affection weren't a moral failing but a human necessity. As if the Americans weren't weak or immoral or strange, but just honest. When did honesty become foreign? When did love become suspicious? Private Anderson smiled at her, a shy, kind smile, and walked away. And Helga realized she was crying, though she couldn't have said exactly why. That night, Helga couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft breathing of the other women around her. Margaret snored gently. Erika tossed and turned, muttering in her dreams. Outside, a guard's footsteps crunched on gravel, steady and reassuring. "We were told they are immoral," Helga thought, the words forming clearly in her mind like an accusation. "We were told they are weak, that they have no discipline, no dignity, no culture. We were told their women are whores, and their men are mongrels, and their society is corrupt and dying." But she'd seen the truth now, hadn't she? She'd seen soldiers who loved their wives, guards who spoke kindly to prisoners, A culture that celebrates affection instead of hiding it. People who seemed impossibly more human than the people who taught her what humanity should be. What else were we told that is false? She whispered into the darkness. No one answered, but the question hung there, terrible and necessary, demanding to be confronted. What else? What about the Jews they'd been told were subhuman? What about the Slavs they'd been taught to despise? What about the entire edifice of belief she'd built her life upon? What if all of it, every single piece, was a lie? The thought was too large, too devastating. It threatened to unmoor her completely, to strip away every certainty she'd ever possessed. She wanted to push it away, to retreat into the comfortable narratives she'd grown up with. But she couldn't, because she'd seen those kisses. She'd seen that love. And once you've seen the truth, you can't unsee it, no matter how desperately you try. The crisis came 3 days later during evening recreation. Several guards were sitting on the steps of the administration building, smoking cigarettes and talking quietly. One of them, Sergeant Miller, waved the women over, surprising everyone. Marie translated his invitation. He wanted to show them something. From his wallet, Miller pulled a photograph. It showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile, holding a baby. "My wife Eleanor," he said, "and my son, James, born last December. I haven't met him yet." He passed the photograph around. The German women studied it carefully, this glimpse into the enemy's private life. Eleanor was pretty, but not glamorous. The baby was red-faced and squalling, captured mid-cry. It was such an ordinary photograph, so unremarkable, and yet Helga found it devastating. "He's beautiful," Margaret said in German, her voice thick. Miller understood the tone, if not the words. He smiled, nodding. "I miss them," he said simply. "Every damn day." Another guard, a corporal named Stevens, pulled out his own photographs. A sweetheart back in Kansas, his parents' farm, his kid brother in a baseball uniform, and suddenly all the guards were sharing, passing around these small rectangles of home, and the German women were looking, really looking, at the lives of the men who held them captive. They were just men, ordinary men who loved their families and missed home and probably hated the war as much as anyone. They weren't monsters. They weren't even particularly foreign when you got down to it. They were just people trying to survive, trying to hold on to whatever scraps of normalcy they could find. Helga felt something twist inside her, guilt, shame, grief. She couldn't tell which. She thought of the propaganda films she'd watched, the posters she'd seen, the speeches she'd believed. She thought of how certain she'd been, how righteous, how pure in her conviction that Germany was good and everyone else was wrong. And she thought, "I was a fool. We were all fools, and God forgive us for what we've done in our foolishness." She handed the photographs back to Miller, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she said in careful English, "for showing us." He nodded, his expression understanding, and in that moment Helga knew that he knew what she was feeling, knew the magnitude of her realization, knew that her entire world was crumbling and there was nothing he could do but witness it with compassion. The tension that night in the barrack was unbearable. Some of the women wouldn't speak. Others couldn't stop speaking, their voices rising in German, arguing, crying, trying to make sense of the senseless. Erika insisted they were being manipulated. Margaret prayed, and Helga sat silent, feeling the weight of a truth she couldn't deny and couldn't yet fully accept. They had been lied to, about everything, and now they had to decide who they would become in the face of that knowledge. Summer deepened into August, and something shifted in the camp. The women had been there 2 months now, long enough for routines, to calcify into familiarity, for faces to become recognizable, for the word enemy to lose some of its sharp edges. Helga had been studying English in the evenings, using a battered textbook the camp librarian had found for her. Her pronunciation was terrible. The "tha" sound eluded her completely, but she persisted, driven by a need she couldn't quite articulate. One afternoon, Sergeant Miller's wife came to visit. Eleanor was smaller than her photograph suggested, with laugh lines around her eyes and baby James strapped to her chest in a cloth carrier. She'd brought cookies for the guards, and on impulse offered some to the German women working in the garden nearby. Helga accepted one, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," she said carefully in English. Eleanor's face lit up. "You speak English? Oh, that's wonderful. I've been so curious about you all." Through halting conversation, supplemented by Marie's translations, a tentative friendship began. Eleanor wanted to know about Germany, not the war, not politics, just ordinary things. What did German women cook? What songs did they sing? What were their homes like? Helga found herself talking about Stuttgart, about her mother's kitchen, about Sunday afternoons at her grandmother's house where the whole family would gather and her uncle would play accordion. She talked about things she hadn't let herself think about in months, and Eleanor listened with genuine interest, nodding, asking questions, treating Helga's memories as valuable and worth preserving. "It sounds beautiful," Eleanor said softly. "I hope you can go back to it someday." The words were so simple, so kind, that Helga had to look away to hide her tears, because she didn't know if there was anything left to go back to. Stuttgart had been bombed. Her father was dead. Klaus had stopped writing. The Germany she remembered might not exist anymore, and even if it did, would it have a place for a woman who'd learned to see Americans as human? Before Eleanor left, she squeezed Helga's hand. "Same time next week?" she asked. Helga nodded, unable to speak, and for the first time since her capture, she felt something that might have been hope. Over the following weeks, other friendships formed. Margaret taught Private Anderson how to say "good morning" in German. Erica, despite her resistance, found herself laughing at Corporal Stevens' terrible jokes. The barriers didn't disappear. They were still prisoners, still technically enemies. But they grew permeable, letting small acts of kindness seep through. The women taught the guards German songs. The guards shared American candy. Someone started a weekly garden club where both sides worked together to coax tomatoes and beans from the French soil. It was absurd, this careful cultivation of normalcy in the middle of war, but it was also necessary, a way of insisting that humanity could persist even in the most inhuman circumstances. Helga found herself thinking less about the war and more about after. What would she do when it ended? Who would she become? The old certainties were gone, burned away by the sight of public kisses and the kindness of captors who should have been cruel. She was being unmade and remade simultaneously, and the process was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The news came on a Tuesday in late August. The camp's American newspaper arrived as it always did, and this time one of the guards left it on the mess hall table where the German women could see it. The headline was stark, accompanied by photographs that made Helga's stomach turn. Concentration camps, liberated, skeletal prisoners, mass graves, evidence of systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension. The women gathered around the newspaper in horrified silence. Marie translated the article in a flat, shocked voice. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. Names that would become synonymous with evil. Places where the regime they'd served had committed atrocities beyond imagination. "It's propaganda," Erica whispered, but her voice shook. "It has to be." But it wasn't. Even as she said it, even as they wanted desperately to believe it was Allied lies, they knew it was true. The photographs didn't lie. The liberated prisoners' eyes didn't lie. The carefully documented evidence didn't lie. Helga sat down heavily, her legs unable to support her. She thought of the propaganda she'd believed, the certainty with which she'd defended the Reich, the pride she'd felt in her service, and all of it had been in service of this. of death camps and gas chambers and the systematic extermination of human beings. Gott verzeih uns, Margarete sobbed. God forgive us. But how could God forgive this? How could anyone forgive this? They hadn't known. Helga was certain of that. But did ignorance matter when the result was the same? They had believed the lies. They had supported the regime. They had been complicit through their faith, their obedience, their willingness to not ask questions. The contrast was unbearable. Here they were, treated with kindness and dignity by the people they'd been taught to despise, while back home, their own government had committed horrors beyond description. The Americans had shown them humanity, while Germany had practiced genocide. The moral universe had inverted completely, and Helga didn't know how to exist in this new, terrible reality. That evening, Sergeant Miller found her sitting alone in the yard, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her, not speaking, just present. After a long silence, he said quietly, "You didn't know." It wasn't a question. It was an absolution she didn't deserve. "Does it matter?" Helga asked in her careful English. "We believed. We served. We—" She couldn't finish. Miller was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "It matters. What you believe now matters. What you do with this knowledge matters. You can't change the past, but you can refuse to let it define your future." Helga looked at him, this enemy soldier who'd shown her more grace than she'd ever shown anyone who was different from her. "How?" she whispered. "By choosing differently," he said simply. "Every single day." The project began organically, born from a need to do something, anything, to reclaim a sense of purpose and humanity. Eleanor had mentioned that she was trying to learn German to surprise her husband, and Helga offered to teach her. Soon, other guards' wives and girlfriends joined, and the informal language lessons became a regular event. But it grew into something more. The German women taught songs, not Nazi anthems, but folk songs, children's songs, the music of a Germany that existed before the war and might exist after it. The American women taught their own songs in return, jazz standards, church hymns, silly ditties that made everyone laugh despite the language barrier. They shared recipes, swapping cooking techniques and ingredient substitutions, building a fragile bridge between cultures through the universal language of food. They traded stories about their families, their childhoods, their hopes for after the war. And slowly, painfully, the German women began to separate their identity from the regime they'd served. They were German, yes, but they didn't have to be Nazis. Their culture, their language, their heritage existed independently of Hitler's perversion of it. One evening, as they sat in a circle singing "Guter Mond, du gehst so stille," a lullaby about the moon, Helga felt something release in her chest. The song was innocent, beautiful, untainted by politics or war. It belonged to mothers and children, to peaceful nights and gentle dreams. It was hers to reclaim. She looked around the circle, German women and American women, former enemies singing together, and thought, "This is the resistance. This is how we fight back. Not with weapons or ideology, but with this, with connection, with the refusal to let hatred win." It wasn't enough. It could never be enough to balance the scales of what had been done. But it was something. It was a choice to create rather than destroy, to build bridges rather than walls, to insist that humanity could survive even the most determined attempts to extinguish it. After the song ended, Eleanor reached across the circle and took Helga's hand. Neither woman spoke, but the gesture said everything that needed saying. "I see you. You're not your government. We can be better together than we ever were apart." Helga squeezed back, tears streaming down her face, and felt the first stirrings of something that might, eventually, become forgiveness, not for what had been done, but for her own human capacity to have been deceived, and her equally human capacity to change. The orders came in September. The German women were being transferred to a POW camp in England, then eventually repatriated. The news brought mixed emotions. Some of the women wept with relief, desperate to go home, to find out what had survived. Others felt a strange reluctance, as if leaving this place meant leaving behind the people they'd become here. On their last day, Eleanor came to say goodbye, bringing James and a package of cookies for the journey. She and Helga stood at the fence, neither quite sure what to say. The summer had changed them both in ways that would take years to fully understand. "Will you write?" Eleanor asked, her voice hopeful but uncertain. "If I can," Helga promised, "if there's anything left to write from." Eleanor shifted James to her other hip and looked directly into Helga's eyes. "There will be. You'll rebuild. You'll survive this. And maybe," she paused, considering, "maybe someday you'll visit America, meet my family, see how we live." The idea was absurd, impossible. A German woman visiting America as a guest rather than a prisoner. And yet, hearing it spoken aloud, it didn't seem entirely out of reach. The war would end. Time would pass. Perhaps, eventually, former enemies could become friends in truth rather than just in stolen moments at a prison camp. "I would like that," Helga said softly. "Very much." They embraced then. A real embrace. Not the stiff, formal kind Helga had grown up with, but the American kind, full and warm and unashamed. And when they pulled apart, both women were crying. Sergeant Miller came to say goodbye as well, shaking Helga's hand with genuine warmth. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and remember, what you choose now is what matters." As the trucks pulled away from the camp, Helga looked back one last time. She saw the guards waving. She saw Eleanor with James, one small hand raised in farewell. She saw the garden they'd planted together, now full of ripe vegetables ready for harvest, and she thought about all those kisses she'd witnessed, all that unashamed love displayed in public. It had seemed so shocking once, so scandalous. Now she understood it for what it was, not weakness or immorality, but courage. The courage to love openly, to refuse to hide the best parts of yourself, to insist that joy and connection mattered even when the world was burning down around you. "Was für ein Zuhause habe ich," she whispered. "What home do I have?" She didn't know the answer yet. Germany was shattered, her old life was gone, and she was returning to a country that might not want her anymore, that might see her as a traitor for learning to see the enemy as human. But she had something she hadn't had before, the knowledge that it was possible to change, to choose differently, to build something new from the rubble of everything that had been destroyed. She had seen love survive war. She had seen kindness offered across enemy lines. She had seen that people could be better than their worst moments if only they were willing to try. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Years later, decades later, an old woman sits in a comfortable chair in a house in Stuttgart, rebuilt from the ESA rubble. Her granddaughter is visiting, asking about the war, about what it was like. And Helga, now in her 80s, tells her about the camp in Orleans, about the American soldiers and their wives, about the kisses that changed everything. "I thought it was scandalous," she says, smiling at the memory. All that affection, so public, so shameless. I'd been taught it was improper, that decent people didn't behave that way. Her granddaughter laughs. "And now?" "Now," Helga says, her voice soft with wonder, "I understand that they were the decent ones. They were the ones who refused to let war make them hard, who insisted on loving openly even when the world was full of hate. They taught me that love, real love, the kind you're not ashamed of, is the most radical act of resistance there is." She pauses, looking out the window at the street where couples walk hand in hand, where young lovers kiss without fear, where ordinary people live their ordinary lives in a peace her younger self never thought possible. "The Nazis tried to make us afraid of everything different," she continues. afraid of other cultures, other ways of loving, other ways of being human. And that fear made us complicit in terrible things. But those American soldiers and their families, they showed me that the opposite of fear isn't courage. It's openness. It's the willingness to let love be visible, to make affection ordinary, to refuse to hide the best parts of ourselves. Her granddaughter is quiet, thinking. Finally, she asks, "Do you think we remember enough about what happens when we let fear win?" Helga considers the question carefully. "I think," she says slowly, "that every generation has to choose. Every single day we choose between fear and openness, between suspicion and trust, between the lies that make us feel superior and the truths that make us uncomfortable. The war taught me that the little choices matter. How we treat strangers, how we talk about people who are different, whether we let ourselves see the humanity in those we've been taught to hate." She looks at her granddaughter, this young woman who's grown up in a Germany that learned, painfully, to choose differently. "Those kisses I saw," she says, "they weren't just about romance. They were about refusing to let war make you small, refusing to hide your humanity, refusing to accept that hatred is stronger than love. And every time you choose to be open, to be kind, to see someone else's full humanity, you're doing the same thing. You're resisting the lies. You're choosing the world those soldiers and their wives were fighting for." Outside, a young couple walks by, hand in hand, laughing at some private joke. They pause at the corner to kiss, casual, affectionate, unashamed. And Helga watches them with a smile, remembering a summer in 1944 when such a simple act changed everything she believed about the world. How does love, visible in everyday moments, cut through war's lies? Her granddaughter asks, repeating back the question Helga has posed. Helga's answer is simple, born from lived experience. By reminding us that our enemies are human, that our certainties might be wrong, that the best parts of life, connection, affection, joy, exist beyond borders and ideology. Love makes it harder to hate, and hate is what war requires. She reaches out and takes her granddaughter's hand, this small gesture of affection that once would have seemed too sentimental, too emotional for proper German stoicism. "Never be ashamed to love openly," she says. "Never be ashamed to show your humanity, because somewhere, someone who's been taught to hate is watching. And that simple act of visible love might be the thing that cracks open their certainty and lets the truth in." The afternoon sun slants through the window, warm and golden. In the distance, church bells ring. And an old woman who learned, too late but not too late, to choose differently, sits in peace with her memories and her hope that each new generation will choose better, faster, with less cost in blood and guilt and grief. The war is over, but the choice, between fear and openness, between hatred and love, continues every day, in every small moment, in every public kiss that says, "I refuse to be ashamed of my humanity. I refuse to let lies win. I choose this. I choose us. I choose love." And that, Helga knows, is the only resistance that ever really mattered.